The heat in Dry Creek did not just hang in the air. It had teeth. It bit into the back of Eliza Hart's neck as she walked the dusty track that passed for a main street. A ribbon of red dirt baked to the hardness of brick, the sun. A merciless white coin in a bleached blue sky. Hammered the raw timber of the half-finished railroad station and glared off the tin roof of the saloon. From the blacksmith's shed came the rhythmic clang of a hammer on anvil, a sound as constant and weary as the town's own heartbeat. A hot wind, carrying the scent of sagebrush and thirst, stirred the dust into little devils that danced and died at her feet. Whispers followed Eliza like her own shadow. She was the town seamstress, her stitches fine and her prices fair. But she was also an outsider from back east who had arrived 2 years ago with little more than a sewing box and a quiet sorrow she never spoke of. She kept to herself, which in a place like Dry Creek was a sin second only to horse thieving. When the school teacher had taken ill, she had agreed to fill in, and the whispers grew louder. She was too soft-spoken, too educated. She read books for pleasure, and worst of all, she did not seem to possess the proper fear of the Apache, whose ancestral lands pressed in on all sides of the fledgling town. She felt the eyes on her now, from the men loitering on the saloon porch, from the women who paused in their sweeping to watch her pass. She kept her gaze fixed on the small wooden church at the end of the street, her shoulders straight beneath her simple cotton dress. They did not know the half of it. They did not know that twice a week. She walked a mile out of town to a secluded grove of cottonwoods where 2 Apache children waited for her. Their names were Quito and Besha, and she was teaching them to read the white man's words, a secret she guarded as fiercely as a miser guards his gold. It was a small act of defiance against the hard certainty of the world, a foolish hope planted in the unforgiving soil of the Arizona territory. Her lesson had gone well. Quito had finally mastered the shape of the letter B, his small brown finger tracing it in the dirt with a look of profound concentration. Bisha, quicker and bolder, had read a full line from the primer, "The sun is hot, a simple truth for a simple world." Eliza had smiled, her heart feeling a lightness that was rare in the oppressive heat. She had given them the last of her water and started the walk home as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. She was halfway back to town, rounding the bend where the trail skirted a cluster of rust-colored mesas, when the first gunshot cracked the evening stillness. It was sharp and loud, echoing off the rock walls. Eliza froze, her hand flying to her throat. It was followed by another, then a volley of shots, a chaotic eruption of violence that shattered the peace of the desert. Peeking around a sandstone outcrop, she saw it, a heavy freight wagon. Its sides emblazoned with the words McKendree Rail and Freight was stalled in the middle of the trail. 2 guards lay unmoving in the dust. A third was exchanging fire with a half-dozen figures who had emerged from the rocks. Her blood ran cold. The attackers were crouched low, moving with a fluid purpose. Her mind registered the details in a panicked rush. They wore dusty trail clothes, their faces obscured by bandanas. But it was their voices that struck her, the sharp, clipped commands they shouted to one another. It was English, clear as a bell, with the hard, flat vowels of the East Coast cities she had left behind. "Get the box, hurry it up." One of the men blasted the lock off a large strongbox bolted to the wagon bed. As he heaved it open, something small and dark fluttered from his belt and fell unnoticed to the ground. It was a piece of cloth, a handkerchief, embroidered with the geometric pattern of a desert flower. Eliza knew the design. She had seen it on the cradle boards and buckskin pouches of the Apache women who came to trade. The world seemed to slow down. The remaining guard slumped against a wagon wheel, his rifle clattering to the ground. The robbers grabbed sacks of money from the strongbox, their movements hurried and greedy. The scene was a tableau of brutal efficiency, and it had nothing to do with the Apache. A stray bullet whined past her ear, chipping stone from the rock she hid behind. A small cry escaped her lips. One of the robbers turned his head, his eyes beneath the bandana locking onto her position. He raised his rifle. Eliza was certain she was about to die. Time stopped. Then, from the shadows beside her, a hand shot out, grabbing her arm in a grip of iron. She was yanked backward, pulled behind the safety of the rock with a force that stole her breath. She stumbled, falling against a hard, lean body. She looked up into the dark, unreadable eyes of an Apache warrior. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of fierce concentration. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his long black hair held back by a leather band. A knife was sheathed at his hip and a bow was slung over his back. He put a finger to his lips, his gaze fixed on the scene below. He had appeared as if from the earth itself, silent and sudden. He was Naichi. She did not know his name then, only that he was one of the people the town feared, and he had just saved her life. The robbers, spooked by the stray shot or satisfied with their haul, mounted their horses and galloped away, disappearing into the labyrinth of canyons to the east. The silence they left behind was heavier, more menacing than the noise had been. The Apache warrior gave her one last, lingering look, a look that held a warning and something else she could not name. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he melted back into the rocks and was gone. Eliza was left alone, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of gunpowder and dust filled her lungs. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move. She scurried from her hiding place, her eyes drawn to the small patch of embroidered cloth lying in the dirt. Beside it, glinting in the fading light, was a brass shell casing. She snatched them both up, her fingers closing around them, and ran. She did not stop running until the first lights of Dry Creek appeared through the twilight. By the time she reached the town, the news, or a twisted version of it, had arrived before her. A lone rider, one of Silas McKendry's surveyors, had seen the end of the ambush from a distant ridge and had raced to spread the alarm. The telegraph key was already chattering, sending the lie out across the territory. She found the town in a state of ferment. Men poured out of the saloon, their faces flushed with whiskey and rage, rifles in hand. Women gathered in anxious knots, their voices a low hum of fear. The center of the storm was Silas McKendry himself, standing on the porch of the freight office. He was a big man, his frame filling out an expensive suit, his face handsome in a severe, predatory way. He held up his hands for silence, his voice booming over the crowd. "My friends, we have been attacked. Our payroll wagon, carrying the wages for the honest men building our future, has been robbed. 3 good men are dead, murdered in cold blood." A roar of anger went through the crowd. McKendry let it swell before continuing, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. The surveyor saw them. A war party. Apaches. The word fell like a lit match into a puddle of oil. The fury of the crowd ignited, all their simmering fears and resentments, stoked by the drought and the hardship of frontier life, now had a target. Eliza stood at the edge of the crowd, the small, heavy objects clutched in her hand. They spoke English. She wanted to scream. They were white men, but the words caught in her throat. She looked at the faces around her, twisted with a righteous hatred. She saw Deputy Bale standing beside McKendry, his hand resting on his pistol, nodding in agreement with every word his boss said. To speak now would be to paint a target on her own back. They would call her a liar, an Indian lover. They would not listen. Naichi watched the town from the high rocks, a knot of cold fury tightening in his gut. He had been tracking a mountain lion when he heard the gunfire. He had arrived in time to see the white men robbing the wagon, and to see the woman, the teacher, nearly killed. His instinct had been to help, to pull her from danger. His second instinct, the one honed by years of survival, had been to disappear. He knew how this would play out. Any crime committed within 100 miles would be laid at his people's feet. It was the way of things. This man, McKendry, was using the incident, twisting it into a weapon aimed directly at his people, who were already struggling against the drought and the encroaching iron rails. He had a responsibility to find the men who had done this, to unravel the lie before it choked the life from his tribe. His hunt had just changed. He was no longer tracking a lion. He was tracking a different, more cunning kind of predator. Later that night, the saloon was a hive of activity. McKendry bought a round of drinks for every man in the room. Jed Rourke, a bounty hunter whose cruelty was as legendary as his skill with a rifle, leaned against the bar, listening with a thin smile. "This cannot stand," McKendry declared. Slamming his fist on the bar, "The law is too slow, too far away. We must protect ourselves. I am personally offering a reward, $500 in gold for the man who brings me the head of the Apache chief responsible for this massacre." A cheer went up. Jed Rourke pushed himself off the bar, his eyes glittering. "I reckon I'll take you up on that offer, Mr. McKendry," he said, his voice a low drawl that was more menacing than any shout. In her small room behind the dress shop, Eliza lit a single candle. By its flickering light, she examined the objects she had taken. The handkerchief was finely stitched, the work of a skilled hand. It was a beautiful, personal thing, now stained with the red dust of the crime scene. It was a lion cloth form. The shell casing was more direct. She turned it over and saw the small, stamped insignia on its base, a stylized Z intertwined with an M. Silas McKendry. His own private security firm used these custom cartridges. The town was thirsty, thirsty for water, thirsty for prosperity, and now thirsty for revenge. And Silas McKendry was serving them a poisoned cup. Eliza wrapped the handkerchief and the shell casing in a scrap of calico and hid them at the bottom of her sewing box, beneath the spools of thread and packets of needles. They were small things, a piece of cloth and a bit of brass, but in the parched landscape of Dry Creek, she knew they were seeds, seeds of a truth so dangerous. She feared it would burn down the whole town if it ever saw the light of day. And she, the quiet seamstress who just wanted to be left alone, was the one who held the match. The weight of it settled upon her, heavy as a shroud. The 2 days that followed the robbery were a slow fever in Dry Creek. Fear and suspicion curdled the air, thick as the dust that coated everything. Men who were once just neighbors now walked with rifles cradled in their arms, their eyes narrowed and searching. They gathered in the street, their voices low and angry, forming a town militia that was little more than a mob with a purpose. Silas McKendry fed their rage, his words painting a picture of savage marauders at their doorstep, a threat that only swift, brutal action could answer. Jed Rourke and a few of his hard-faced men had already ridden out, disappearing into the mesas with the casual confidence of wolves on a hunt. Eliza felt a cage of silence closing around her. The truth she held felt like a burning coal in her pocket. Every shouted threat against the Apache, every boast from the newly formed posse, was a lie she was complicit in. She could not go to Deputy Bale. He was McKendry's man, through and through. To speak out in the town square would be suicide. They would turn on her in an instant. There was only one person who could use the evidence. One person who had a right to know the full depth of the deception. The warrior who had pulled her from the line of fire. Naichi. Finding him was a terrifying prospect. He was a ghost, a shadow, but she had to try. He had saved her, and now she held the key to saving his people from a war they did not start. As twilight began to bleed across the sky on the second day, softening the hard edges of the desert, she made her decision. Slipping the small calico bundle into her apron pocket, she left her small house and walked not toward the center of town, but away from it, toward the vast, darkening wilderness that the townsfolk saw only as a place of death. She followed the dry wash, a wide, sandy scar carved into the earth by summer flash floods that were now only a distant memory. The air cooled as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the landscape transformed. Familiar rocks took on the shapes of crouching beasts in the gloom. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her own boots on the gravel and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. The town, with its manufactured fury and electric fear, felt a world away. Here, the fear was older, more honest. It was the fear of being small and alone in a place that was vast and indifferent. She walked for what felt like an eternity, her destination a gnarled black oak she remembered from her walks, a landmark that stood at the edge of the lands the Apache still considered their own. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What if he did not come? What if one of Rourke's patrols found her first? She reached the tree, its dark branches like skeletal arms against the indigo sky. She stood in its shadow, waiting, her senses straining against the gathering night. The minutes stretched out, each one a small lifetime of doubt. She was about to turn back, to admit the foolishness of her quest, when a voice spoke from the darkness right beside her, so close it made her jump. The teacher walks far from her schoolhouse. Nietzsche stepped from the deeper shadows of a rock formation. He moved with a liquid grace that made no sound, his presence both startling and calming. In the faint light, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, his eyes holding a deep, weary caution. Eliza's words came out in a breathless rush. I had to find you. They are blaming your people for the robbery. They have formed a posse. A man named Rourke is hunting for you. A flicker of something, not surprise, but a grim confirmation, passed through his eyes. They always find a reason to hunt. But it is a lie, she insisted, her hand trembling as she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the calico bundle and unfolded it in her palm. The men who robbed the wagon. They were white men. They spoke English like men from the East. One of them dropped this. She held out the embroidered handkerchief. Nietzsche looked at it, and the stoic mask on his face cracked. He took the small square of cloth from her hand with a reverence that startled her. He ran his thumb over the stitched pattern of the desert flower, his jaw tight. The warrior who had faced down a rifle barrel without flinching now looked vulnerable, his gaze fixed on the simple piece of needlework. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice low and strained. It fell from one of the robbers, at the wagon. This was made by my sister, he said, the words heavy with a pain that needed no translation. Taza, her hands made this stitch. He looked up at Eliza, his eyes boring into hers, all weariness replaced by a raw, urgent intensity. She has been missing for 5 days. She disappeared 2 days before your wagon was attacked. The implication settled over Eliza with a chilling weight. The robbery was not just a robbery. The handkerchief was not just a piece of planted evidence. They had taken his sister. The crime was deeper and more personal than she could have imagined. Her mission to clear the Apache of theft had suddenly become a quest to help rescue a captive girl. I also found this, she said, holding out the brass shell casing. There is a mark on the bottom. He took it, turning it over in the moonlight. He did not recognize the symbol, but he understood its meaning. A clue. It is more than my people have. He looked back toward the distant, flickering lights of Dry Creek. You have put yourself in great danger by coming here, by keeping these things. Telling the truth should not be dangerous, she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Before he could reply, a sound drifted down the wash, the clink of a horseshoe on rock, followed by a low murmur of voices. Nietzsche's hand shot out, pulling her down behind a thicket of mesquite. He moved with the same swift silence as before, his body shielding hers as he peered through the thorny branches. 2 riders came into view, their silhouettes dark against the skyline. They were Rourke's men, their rifles held ready across their saddles. They stopped not 20 yards from where Eliza and Nietzsche were hidden. See anything, one of them asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. Nothing but snakes and lizards, the other replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. Rourke's wasting our time out here. The chief he's after is probably halfway to Mexico by now. Rourke gets paid either way. McKendry wants a body. Any Apache body will do. Rourke will find him one. They laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the night stillness. They lingered for a moment, scanning the wash, their eyes passing right over the mesquite bush. Then, satisfied, they nudged their horses forward and continued on their way. Eliza let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. The casual cruelty of their words made her feel sick. Naichi remained perfectly still until the sound of their horses had faded completely. "You must go back," he said, his voice a low command. "It is not safe for you here." He helped her to her feet. As she turned to leave, her boot snagged on something. She pitched forward, a sharp cry escaping her lips as she fell. Naichi caught her, but not before they both heard the telltale twang of a taut wire being disturbed, followed by the whip-like sound of a sapling springing back into place. Naichi's reaction was instantaneous. He threw himself and Eliza sideways, rolling them both into a shallow depression in the sand just as a heavy, sharpened log, released by the tripwire, swung through the space where they had been standing. It slammed into the trunk of the black oak with a sickening thud, the force of the impact splitting the wood. It was a deadfall trap, crude but lethal, and she had walked right into it. He was on his feet in a second, pulling her up behind him. He stood over her for a moment, his body a tense shield, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the trap's owner. He held his knife in his hand now, the blade catching the faint starlight. In that moment, he was not just a man. He was every inch the warrior the town feared, a figure of deadly competence and lethal grace. The skill he possessed was not for murder and robbery. It was for survival, for the protection of his own. When he was certain they were alone, he turned back to her, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Rourke does not just hunt. He lays snares like he is trapping an animal." He looked at her, his anger softening into something else, a deep and troubling concern. "You cannot come here again. It is too dangerous." "But how will I know?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How will I know if you have found your sister?" He thought for a moment, his gaze falling on a solitary Joshua tree that stood on a nearby rise, its strange, twisted arms reaching for the sky. "Do you see that tree?" he asked. She nodded. "If I have news, I will place 3 flat stones, one on top of the other, at its base. If you have something for me, you will do the same." It was a language of stones, a silent promise in a world full of loud, angry lies. It was a thread of trust, fragile and thin, spun in the heart of the wilderness. "Go now," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "and walk carefully." He watched her until her form was swallowed by the darkness. A small, determined figure walking back toward the town of lies. He clutched the embroidered handkerchief in his hand. It was all he had left of Taza, a memory of her quiet laugh, of her nimble fingers, and now, a clue. He looked at the deep gouge the deadfall trap had made in the oak tree. Rourke and McKendry had stolen more than money. They had stolen a person, his person, and they had built a trap of lies around his people. He would hunt them, not for bounty, not for glory, but for justice and for his sister. The dry wash held no water, but tonight it held the promise of a reckoning. The silence of the desert was a living thing, but the noise of the town was a machine. Its gears were rumor and its engine was fear. And at its controls sat Silas McKendry. Every shriek of the train whistle from the half-built station at the end of the street sounded like his victory cry. The telegraph in his office chattered day and night, clicking out his version of the truth to the wider world, a web of lies spun from copper wire. Eliza knew she could not wait for a sign of stones by a Joshua tree. Naichi was out in the wilderness hunting for his sister, but the source of the poison was right here, in the heart of Dry Creek. The shell casing in her sewing box was a cold, hard fact, and it pointed directly to the railroad. She needed to get closer. She needed a reason to be inside the beast, to see its workings. Survival, she realized, was the perfect mask for subterfuge, with the town's menfolk spending their days forming militias and their nights drinking to their own courage. Ordinary work was being neglected. Opportunity, like a desert weed, could grow in the hardest ground. She put on her plainest dress, tied her hair back severely, and walked directly to the railroad freight office. The building smelled of fresh-cut pine, sweat, and the metallic tang of the telegraph. Men shouted orders. Wagons rumbled outside, and the air buzzed with frantic, disorganized energy. McKendry's private office was a quiet island in the chaos. He sat behind a large oak desk, a map of the territory spread out before him, black lines marking the relentless march of his rails. He looked up as she entered, his eyes a pale, assessing blue. He did not seem surprised to see her. "Miss Hart, to what do I owe the pleasure?" His voice was smooth, cultured, a stark contrast to the rough voices outside. "Mr. McKendry," she said, keeping her own voice steady, her hands clasped in front of her, "I am in need of work. My sewing business is not what it was, and with the school closed. I am a hard worker, and my penmanship is clear. I thought perhaps you might have need of someone to keep ledgers or manage inventory." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He studied her for a long moment, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. It was the look of a man who enjoyed holding all the cards. "Inventory," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "It is true. Things are in a state of some disarray. The recent troubles have been distracting." He gestured to a chair, an invitation that felt like a command. "Tell me, Miss Hart, you are a woman of education. What do you make of our current predicament?" The question was a trap, and they both knew it. "It is a terrible business," she said carefully, choosing words that were true but not the truth. "The loss of life is a tragedy." "Indeed," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "And yet, some in this town do not seem to possess a proper sense of urgency. They seem to think this is a problem that will simply fade away. I, on the other hand, believe that a threat must be met with strength. Do you not agree?" "I believe people are frightened," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "They are," he agreed, his smile widening slightly. "Which is why they need a leader, someone to provide for them, to protect them." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street. "This railroad is the future. Miss Hart, it is life. But to create life, one must sometimes clear away the dead wood." He turned back to her, his expression one of magnanimous concern. "You find yourself alone here, in a rough place. It can be dangerous for a woman of your quality. The closer you are to me, to the work we are doing here, the safer you will be. I think you understand that." It was not an offer of employment. It was a threat wrapped in velvet, a promise of protection that was also a warning. He was drawing her into his orbit, where he could watch her, and she, in turn, was walking willingly into the spider's web. "I understand completely. Mr. McKendry," she said, "I would be grateful for the work." "Excellent," he said, his smile finally reaching his eyes. It made him look no warmer. "You can start tomorrow, in the main warehouse. We will find a desk for you." The following morning, Eliza entered the cavernous freight warehouse. It was a world of crates and barrels, the air thick with the smell of sawdust, axle grease, and burlap. Her desk was a small, rickety table near the main doors, a position that allowed her to see everything and everyone that came and went. She spent the morning with the chief foreman, a harried man named Peters, learning the complex system of shipping manifests and inventory logs. She applied herself to the task, her handwriting neat and precise, her questions intelligent. She made herself appear diligent, unassuming, and utterly harmless. Her opportunity came after the noon meal, when the warehouse was quiet and most of the men were outside in the shade. On the pretext of organizing a back corner that had fallen into disarray, she made her way toward a stack of long, narrow crates stenciled with the name of a weapons manufacturer back east. They were set apart from the other goods, partially covered by a canvas tarp. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She moved the tarp aside. There they were, crate after crate of ammunition. She ran her finger along the stenciled lettering on the side of one of the boxes. It was a series of numbers and letters, a lot number, with a trembling hand. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out the small brass shell casing. She held it up to the light filtering through a grimy window, comparing the tiny stamped insignia on its base to the number on the crate. They matched. It was a perfect, undeniable match. The bullet that had been fired during the robbery had come from Silas McKendry's private stock, a shipment he kept under lock and key in his own warehouse. The proof was right here, cold and irrefutable, stenciled in black paint on raw wood. A wave of nausea and triumph washed over her. She was not imagining things. She was not wrong. At that very moment, a shadow fell over her small house. Deputy Bale did not bother to knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He looked around the small, tidy room, his lip curling in a faint sneer. It was too clean, too orderly for his taste. He was not looking for anything specific. He was on a fishing expedition, sent by McKendry to apply pressure. The teacher was too quiet, too observant. She had been near the ambush. McKendry wanted to know what she had seen, or what she might have. Bale moved through the single room with a casual brutality, pulling books from her small shelf and letting them fall to the floor. He opened her sewing box, his thick fingers rummaging through the spools of thread and neatly folded fabric scraps. He did not find the hidden bundle. Eliza had it with her. He ran a hand under her thin mattress, overturned her flour sack, and kicked at the small rag rug by the hearth. "You the quiet type, ain't you? Miss Hart," he said to the empty room. "Quiet types always got secrets." He was looking for anything out of the ordinary. An Apache bead, a feather, any small token that would confirm the town's suspicion that she was sympathetic to the natives. Finding nothing, his frustration grew. He left the room in a state of calculated disarray, a clear message that her private space was not her own, that she was being watched. When Eliza returned home that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor, she stopped dead in the doorway. Her heart seized. The violation of her home was more jarring than any open threat. Her books, her most prized possessions, lay scattered like fallen leaves. Her meager supplies were overturned. It was an act of intimidation, designed to frighten her into silence. Instead, it kindled a cold, hard anger in her soul. The guilt she had felt over her own deceptions vanished, burned away by the certainty that she was on the right side of this fight. She cleaned the mess, her movements methodical, her mind racing. The evidence she held was too dangerous to keep. She could not trust anyone in Dry Creek. She had to get word to an authority outside of McKendry's reach. She remembered hearing Teamsters talk of Judge Boone, a federal circuit judge who held court in Cedar Junction, a day's ride away. He was said to be a hard man, but a fair one, immune to the influence of local strongmen. That night, by the light of a single candle, she composed a letter. She did not sign her name. She wrote with her left hand, deliberately making the script uneven and crude. She kept it short, a simple plea from a concerned citizen. She wrote of the payroll robbery, and of evidence that suggested the blame had been wrongly placed. She did not mention the shell casing, only that there was proof that pointed away from the Apache and toward powerful interests in Dry Creek. She urged the judge to investigate the matter himself, quietly and quickly, before an innocent people were made to pay for a crime they did not commit. The next morning, she walked to the post office, a small shack that also served as the general store. The postmaster, a balding man named Henderson with nervous, darting eyes, took her letter. He weighed it in his palm, his gaze lingering on the address, the Honorable Judge Boone, Cedar Junction. "Important business?" he asked, his attempt at a casual tone failing. "Just a letter to family." Eliza lied smoothly. She paid the postage and watched as he tossed the letter into the canvas bag destined for the morning mail rider. She left the store with a small, fragile sense of hope. She had cast a stone into the water. Now all she could do was wait for the ripples. She did not see Henderson. An hour later, watched the mail rider depart. She did not see him walk to the telegraph office, and she did not see Jed Rourke, who had been waiting in the shade of the livery stable. Meet the mail rider a mile out of town. The rider, a young man who valued his health, handed over the single letter addressed to Judge Boone without argument. Rourke tore it open. He read the crude script under the harsh sun, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. He crumpled the letter into a ball and tossed it into the sagebrush. They had a traitor in their midst. The game had just become much more interesting. While Eliza played her careful game of deception in the heart of Dry Creek, Nietzsche moved through the wilderness like a phantom, his world stripped down to the fundamental truths of earth and sky. He did not hunt men for money or for sport. He hunted them for a reason that was etched into his very soul. He hunted for Taza. He left the familiar territory of his people and pushed east, into the broken country of Escondido Ridge, a jagged spine of rock and stunted juniper that offered 1,000 places for men to hide. The trail was cold, nearly 5 days old, but the dry air had preserved it. He found the tracks of shod horses, their iron shoes leaving a clear story in the hard-packed dirt. These were not the horses of his people, nor the worn shoes of local prospectors. These were heavy animals, well-fed, their shoes new and expertly fitted. They were the mounts of paid men. With them. He found another set of tracks that made the muscles in his jaw tighten. Boot prints, but not the soft-soled moccasins of the Apache or the worn, cracked leather boots of the townsfolk. These prints had a hard, sharp edge at the heel, a small crescent shape that bit into the ground, iron plates. He had seen them before on the boots of soldiers and railroad security men. A mark of the East, designed for city cobblestones. Not the silent stalking of the desert. They moved through the land with noisy arrogance. These men, they believed no one was capable of reading the clumsy story they left behind. He followed the trail for 2 days, moving with a patient, tireless gait. He ate little, a handful of dried berries and a strip of jerky, and drank less, conserving the water in his goatskin bag. He became an extension of the landscape, his buckskin blending with the dun-colored rocks, his movements economical and precise. He felt the world with every sense, the shift in the wind, the call of a distant hawk, the scent of rain on the dry air. The sky, which had been a merciless, clear blue, was beginning to haze over with a high, thin layer of gray. A storm was coming, an unseasonal gift of moisture that could be a blessing or a curse. It could give him water, but it could also wash away the trail forever. The tracks led him upward, into a labyrinth of narrow canyons and weathered sandstone hoodoos that stood like silent, watching giants. Here, the boot prints became more numerous, scarring the ground around a shallow cave set high on a cliff face. The mouth of the cave was almost invisible, screened by a curtain of long dead ivy. Nietzsche approached with infinite caution, his knife in his hand, his body low to the ground. He listened for long minutes, but the only sound was the rising wind whistling through the rocks. Inside, the air was stale and close. The light from the entrance was dim, but it was enough. The cave was empty of men, but it was full of signs. Scuff marks on the floor spoke of a struggle. A length of coarse hemp rope lay discarded in a corner, one end frayed as if it had been cut in a hurry. He ran his fingers along it. He had seen rope like this used by the Pinkerton agents the railroad sometimes hired, tied with a specific knot designed to hold fast. But it was the discovery in the far corner that made his blood run cold. Lying in the dust, almost invisible, was a small, dark object. It was a severed braid of black hair, tied off with a simple leather thong, his sister's hair. He picked it up, his hand, which could wield a knife with deadly precision, now trembling. He could see her as a child, sitting patiently while their mother wove her hair into 2 thick braids that hung down her back. It was her pride, a symbol of her strength and her spirit. That they had cut it was an act of profound violation, a message of dominance and cruelty. It was a cry for help she could not voice. He closed his fist around the braid, the soft strands a painful reminder of what was at stake. He knew now, with a terrible certainty, that she was alive and that her captors were not just thieves. They were monsters. He had to find her before they decided she was no longer useful. He backed out of the cave, his senses on fire. The discovery had sharpened his focus to a razor's edge. He knew he was close, as his eyes adjusted to the graying daylight. A flicker of movement on the ridge above caught his attention. It was not an animal. It was the glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. He threw himself flat an instant before a gunshot echoed through the canyon, the bullet smacking into the rock face where his head had been. 3 men began to scramble down the rocks from their perch, their iron-heeled boots slipping and sliding on the steep incline. They were clumsy, but they were armed, and they were between him and his only way out of the narrow canyon. Naichi did not run. He faded back into the rocks, using the terrain he knew as well as the lines on his own hand. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, splattering against the stone and making the surfaces slick with a treacherous film of wet dust. The hired guns, emboldened by their numbers, advanced with a reckless confidence. One of them rounded a boulder, his rifle held ready. Naichi was not there. He was above, clinging to a handhold in the rock. He dropped down behind the man, his knife a blur of motion. He did not kill. He struck the man's rifle hand, the blade slicing through sinew and muscle. The man screamed, his rifle clattering to the ground. Naichi was gone before the other 2 could bring their weapons to bear. The rain was falling harder now, a steady, chilling downpour. The wind howled, and small cascades of pebbles and grit began to wash down the canyon walls. A second man tried to rush him, firing wildly. Naichi dodged behind a pillar of rock, the bullets whining past him. He picked up a loose stone the size of his fist and threw it with a powerful, snapping motion. It struck the man squarely in the forehead. He crumpled to the ground, stunned. The third man was more cautious. He stayed back, using a rock outcropping for cover, trying to get a clear shot. The rain was a gray curtain between them, distorting sight and sound. Naichi knew he had to end this. He let out a loud cry, a warrior's challenge. From the left, as the gunman swung his rifle in that direction, Naichi came from the right, a silent, charging shadow. He hit the man low, driving his shoulder into his midsection. They went down in a tangle of limbs, grappling on the wet, slippery rock. The man was strong, his arms thick with muscle, but Naichi was faster, his movements more fluid. He twisted, using the man's own weight against him, and brought his knife to the man's throat. The hired gun froze, his eyes wide with terror, the cold steel pressing against his skin. "Where is she?" Naichi demanded, his voice a low growl. "The Apache girl. Where did you take her?" The man was panting, rain and sweat plastering his hair to his face. "I do not know nothing." Naichi pressed the knife harder, a single drop of blood welling up. "You have one chance to live," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "Where?" All right, the man gasped, his bravado gone. "There is a camp, an old prospector's camp, by Cottonwood Creek. That is all I know, I swear." At that exact moment, a different sound split the air. It was not the loud boom of the hired gun's rifles. It was a sharp, flat crack, the report of a high-powered buffalo gun fired from a great distance. The man beneath Naichi stiffened, a look of shocked surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in his chest. His eyes went glassy, and he slumped sideways, dead. Naichi rolled away, instinctively seeking cover. He had been so focused on the fight in front of him that he had failed to sense the greater danger. The shooter was on the far ridge, a tiny figure barely visible through the driving rain. A professional, a hunter. It had to be Rourke. He was not just leading the posse. He was cleaning up his own mess, silencing any witness who could tie him and McKendry to the kidnapping. A second shot kicked up a spray of rock and dirt near Naichi's feet. He was exposed. He began to run, not in a straight line, but in a zigzag pattern, scrambling over rocks and sliding down scree slopes. Another bullet tore through the sleeve of his buckskin shirt, grazing his arm. The wound was shallow, a hot, searing line of pain, but it was enough to make his arm feel numb and clumsy. He scrambled over a ledge just as a small rock slide, loosened by the torrential rain, gave way beneath him. He fell, tumbling down a steep embankment, his body battered by rocks and thorny bushes. He landed hard in the muddy wash at the bottom of the canyon, the breath knocked out of him. He lay there for a moment, stunned, the cold rain washing over him. The bleeding in his arm was not severe, but it was steady. He forced himself to his feet, his body a map of new aches and pains. He had a name, Cottonwood Creek, but he was injured, and Rourke was up there on the ridge, hunting him like an animal. The rain was his only ally now, a cloak that would hide his tracks and obscure him from the rifleman's sight. He had to get to shelter, to tend to his arm, to rest, to think. To go back to his own people would be to lead Rourke right to them. The town was a death trap. But there was one place, a small island of potential sanity in a sea of madness. The house of the quiet teacher, the woman who had risked everything to bring him the truth. It was a desperate gamble. But as the storm broke in full fury around him, Nietzsche turned his face toward Dry Creek. He was no longer just a hunter. He was the hunted, and his only hope lay in the courage of a woman he barely knew. The storm broke over Dry Creek with a sudden, biblical fury. Rain did not fall. It was thrown from the sky in solid, wind-driven sheets that turned the dusty street into a churning river of red mud. Thunder cannoned across the mesas, and lightning bleached the world white for a split second, revealing a landscape in turmoil. Inside her small cabin, Eliza Hart had barred the door and shuttered the windows. The wind shrieked at the corners of the little house, and the steady drumming of rain on the roof was a frantic, desperate sound. The only warmth, the only point of calm in the maelstrom, was the small fire she had built in the stone hearth. It crackled and spat, its orange light pushing back the shadows, creating a small, besieged sanctuary. A sound at the door, different from the storm's assault, made her freeze. It was a soft, heavy thud, almost lost in the gale. She waited, her heart a trip hammer in her chest, listening. It came again, a fumbling, scraping noise. It was not the confident knock of a neighbor. It was something else, something desperate. Holding a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, she crept to the door. "Who is there?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. A low voice answered, muffled by the wood and the storm. The teacher. It was him, Nietzsche. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy wooden bar. She pulled the door inward, and he practically fell into the room, bringing the storm with him. He was soaked to the bone, his buckskin dark with rain, his black hair plastered to his face and neck. He leaned against the door frame for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A dark stain was spreading across the sleeve and shoulder of his shirt, a stain that was not just rainwater. "You are hurt," she said, the words a statement, not a question. She pushed the door shut against the howling wind and dropped the bar back into place, sealing them inside together. He nodded, pushing himself upright. He looked around the small, warm room as if it were a mirage. Water dripped from him, pooling on the floorboards. "He was waiting for me," he said, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "Rourke." "Come to the fire," she commanded, her fear replaced by a sudden, fierce resolve. She took his good arm and led him to the hearth, settling him onto the small rag rug before the flames. "Let me see." Gently, she helped him peel away the wet buckskin shirt. The wound was a long, ragged tear along his upper arm, crusted with dirt and blood. It was not deep, but it was ugly. He had been lucky. An inch sewn either way and the bullet would have shattered bone. He sat stoically, his face a mask of endurance, as she went to her small cupboard and came back with a basin of clean water, soap, and strips of linen torn from an old petticoat. She knelt before him and began to clean the wound. Her touch was gentle, her movements practiced and sure. The firelight played across his broad shoulders and the hard muscles of his chest. He was built like the land he came from, all lean strength and resilience. As she worked, her fingers brushed against a different mark just below his collarbone, a pale, puckered line of scarred tissue, old and white against his bronze skin. He flinched, not from the pain of the new wound, but from the touch on the old one. "I am sorry," she whispered. He was silent for a long moment, watching the fire, his eyes distant. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the relentless assault of the storm outside. "A soldier gave me that one," he said, his voice quiet. She paused in her bandaging, looking at him. "You were a soldier." A bitter smile touched his lips. "I was a scout, for the army. I wore their blue coat." He looked down at the old scar, as if seeing a ghost. There was a treaty, a promise of peace. My chief believed them. He sent me to help them, to show them the safe paths through the mountains, to keep the peace between our people and the new settlers. I did it because I believed it would protect my village. I led the soldiers on patrols, away from our lands, showing them where the renegade bands were not. I trusted their commander. He fell silent again, the memory a heavy weight in the small room. "While I was gone," he continued, his voice barely audible over the storm, "another troop, under another commander, came from the south. They did not honor the treaty. They found a small village, a peaceful one, full of women and children and old men. The one I was supposed to be protecting." He closed his eyes. "The man who gave me this scar told me I was a fool to believe a white man's promise. He was right." The story hung in the air between them, a tale of betrayal that was achingly familiar. His wound was not just the pale line on his skin. It was the deeper, invisible scar on his trust. He had tried to build a bridge, and they had burned it, with him standing in the middle. Eliza finished tying the bandage, her fingers lingering for a moment on his arm. "I was to be married once," she said softly, her gaze on the dancing flames. She had never spoken of this to anyone in Dry Creek. His name was Arthur. He was an engineer for the railroad, a man of great ambition. He saw the future in steel rails and telegraph wires. He said we were bringing order to the chaos. She smoothed her apron, her hands needing something to do. I believed in him. I believed in the life we would build, but I also believed in teaching. When I came here, I saw the Apache children watching from the edges of town, their eyes full of a hunger to learn, so I started helping them, just as I do now, in secret. She risked a glance at him. He was watching her, his dark eyes intent. Some of the townsfolk found out. They called me a traitor. They said I was giving aid to the enemy. Arthur, he agreed with them. He said my actions were jeopardizing his position, his future with the railroad. He told me I had to choose, the children or him. "You chose the children," Nietzsche said. It was not a question. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "He called me a fool, too, for wasting my heart on a lost cause. He left on the next train east." She looked up at Nietzsche, and in the warm firelight, she saw an understanding that went beyond words. They were from different worlds, a seamstress and a warrior, but they carried the same wound. They had both been abandoned for trying to do what was right. A fragile trust began to sprout in the space between them, a tender green shoot in the scorched earth of their pasts. Suddenly, a sound from outside cut through the roar of the storm, the distinct sound of horses, several of them, and the low rumble of men's voices. They were close, too close. Eliza's hand flew to her mouth, and Nietzsche was instantly alert, every muscle tensed. He moved silently to the shuttered window, peering through a tiny crack. A party of riders, the town militia, was slowly making its way down the muddy street, lanterns swinging, their figures dark and menacing against the rain. They were searching. Eliza and Nietzsche stood frozen, 2 feet apart, listening as the voices grew louder, then faded as the patrol passed by. The danger was gone, for now, But the fragile sanctuary of the cabin felt paper-thin. The world, with all its hatred and suspicion, was just outside the door. They sat back down by the fire. The silence now charged with a new tension. The warmth of their shared confessions was chilled by the reality of their situation. He was a hunted man, and she was harboring him. Then came a new sound, a knock. It was sharp, authoritative. 3 quick raps on the wooden door. It was nothing like Naichi's desperate arrival. This was a summons. Eliza's blood ran cold. Naichi was on his feet in a single, fluid motion, his knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes commanding her to be still. He moved into the darkest corner of the room, becoming one with the shadows. "Eliza Hart," a voice called out. It was Jed Rourke's lazy drawl. "Slick and dangerous. We saw your light. Just checking to make sure you are all right in this storm." Eliza's throat was dry. It was a test, a trap. She looked at Naichi. He shook his head. A minute. Almost imperceptible movement. Silence. They waited. Every nerve screaming. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Outside, there was only the sound of the rain and the wind. They could hear the creak of saddle leather, a man shifting his weight. No answer. Another voice said, "Probably asleep." "Maybe," Rourke's voice replied, sounding unconvinced. There was a long pause. Eliza could picture him out there, his cold eyes studying the small cabin, sensing something amiss. Then came the sound of his boots squelching in the mud as he walked away. The hoofbeats of the horses receded, finally swallowed by the storm. Eliza sagged against the wall, letting out a breath she did not know she had been holding. They were safe, but it was the safety of a mouse when the cat has momentarily lost interest. Naichi stepped out of the shadows, his face grim. The brief moment of warmth and connection by the fire was gone, replaced by the cold calculus of survival. "I cannot stay here," he said. "They will be back." "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "The man I caught told me something before Rourke silenced him." Naichi said, "A place. Cottonwood Creek. That is where they are holding my sister." He looked at his bandaged arm, then at her. "I will leave before dawn." Eliza looked at the barred door, at the fire now burning low, at the wounded man before her who carried the weight of his people on his shoulders. She thought of her broken engagement, of the life of quiet retreat she had built for herself. It was a life of hiding. She was done hiding. "No," she said, her voice finding a strength she did not know it possessed. "You are injured. You do not know how many men are there. You cannot go alone." She took a deep breath, the decision settling in her heart with a weight of absolute certainty. "We will go together." His words, "We will go together," hung in the air between them, a declaration that seemed both reckless and absolutely necessary. The storm, as if in response, threw a furious gust of wind against the small cabin, making the timbers groan and the fire in the hearth leap and dance, casting their shadows long and distorted upon the rough-hewn walls. Naichi looked at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and a deep, troubled gravity. The flicker of warmth, of shared understanding that had passed between them moments before, was now replaced by the warrior's cold pragmatism. He shook his head, a slow, definitive motion. "No," he said, his voice low and firm. "You will not." He turned away from her, beginning to check the tautness of his bowstring, the knife at his hip. His movements were a form of argument, a physical manifestation of his intent to go alone. "This is not your fight. You are a teacher, a seamstress. You do not know the ways of the wilderness, or the ways of men like Rourke. You would be a liability." The words were blunt, meant to wound her pride and drive her back to the safety of reason. But Eliza did not flinch. The woman who had trembled at shadows in the wash was gone, burned away by the violation of her home and the cold fury that had taken its place. "A liability," she repeated, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "Rourke knocked on my door tonight. Deputy Bale has already torn my home apart looking for evidence. Silas McKendry as much as threatened me in his office. Do you truly believe I will be safer here, waiting for them to come back and ask more pointed questions?" She took a step closer to him, her hands clenched at her sides. "My safety left the moment I chose not to be a silent witness. Staying here is not a choice. It is a cage, and I would be waiting in it alone." He stopped his preparations and faced her, his dark eyes searching hers. He saw no fear in them, only a fierce, unyielding determination that mirrored his own. It unsettled him. "I can move faster alone," he argued, his voice softening slightly, reasoning with her now instead of commanding her. "I can hide more easily. With you, the risk is doubled." "And what is your plan when you find this camp at Cottonwood Creek?" she countered, pressing her advantage. "You are one man, and you are wounded. How many of them are there, 5'10"? You cannot fight them all, but I can do what you cannot. I can walk into that camp in broad daylight. I am a white woman. I can be a lost traveler, a delivery person from McKendry. 100 things you can never be. I can be a distraction. I can learn their numbers, their positions. I can help you. Naiche, but only if I am there." Every word she spoke was a thread in a net of inescapable logic. He had spent his entire life relying on his own strength, his own senses, his own solitary courage. Trust was a currency he had learned was always counterfeit. To depend on another was to invite betrayal, to create a weakness that an enemy could exploit. His every instinct, honed by a lifetime of bitter experience, screamed at him to push her away, to leave her behind, to keep her safe by keeping her separate from his world of violence and shadows. To take her with him felt like a profound failure of his duty to protect her. The storm outside began to change. The violent, percussive drumming of the rain on the roof softened to a steady, rhythmic patter. The shrieking of the wind in the eaves subsided into a low, mournful sigh. The peak of the tempest had passed, leaving in its wake a deep, resonant quiet. A world washed clean and listening. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals, pulsing with a gentle, hypnotic heat. The light was soft, intimate. It was a light for confessions, not for arguments. Naiche stood, his body a study in conflict. He looked at the barred door, then back at her. The path of his life had been a solitary one, a track he had made for himself through a harsh and unforgiving landscape. To allow someone to walk it with him felt more dangerous than facing a dozen armed men. "I will not be the cause of your death," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. He picked up his still damp buckskin shirt, the one she had so carefully cleaned and set by the fire to dry. It was a clear signal. He was preparing to leave. The argument was over. He had made his decision. His responsibility for her safety outweighed any logic she presented. He would go, as he had always gone, alone. Eliza watched him, her heart sinking. She saw the impenetrable wall he had built around himself, a fortress of solitude constructed from the stones of past betrayals. She could not breach it with reason. There was only one thing left: the truth. She crossed the small space between them until she stood directly before him. He stopped, the shirt held in his hand, his gaze questioning. She reached out, not to stop him, and placed her hand gently on his uninjured arm. His skin was warm from the fire. "Don't leave tonight," she whispered. The words were barely a breath, yet they struck him with the force of a physical blow. They were not an argument. They were not a demand. They were a plea, stripped of all artifice, a simple, profound request that laid her own heart bare. It was an appeal not to the warrior, but to the man. It spoke of the shared solitude of the storm, of the fragile connection they had forged by the firelight, of the terrifying prospect of facing the coming dawn alone. He stood perfectly still, the shirt falling from his grasp to the floor. He looked down at her, and in his eyes, she saw the walls of his fortress begin to crumble. He saw not a liability, but an ally. He saw not a woman to be protected, but a partner whose courage matched his own. And And he saw something more, something that frightened and drew him in equal measure, a reflection of the same deep loneliness he carried within himself. He had lived his life by a harsh code of self-reliance, believing it was the only way to survive. But her quiet plea offered a different kind of strength, one found not in solitude, but in solidarity. It was a terrifying, exhilarating possibility. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands, not to push her away, but to the fastenings of the damp, heavy poncho he still wore over his shoulders. It was a garment of pure utility, a shield against the elements. Much like the stoic resolve he wore as a shield against the world, he unfastened the leather ties, his movements unhurried. He was not just removing a layer of wet cloth. He was making a choice. He was shedding the armor that had kept him safe and alone. For so long, he let the heavy garment slide from his shoulders. It landed with a soft thud at his feet. He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze a silent question. It was a search for consent, for a shared understanding that this moment was more than a surrender to the night. It was an agreement, a covenant made in the eye of the storm. Eliza did not look away. She gave him her answer, not in words, but in the quiet, unwavering trust in her eyes. They came together by the dying light of the fire, a seamstress from the east and an Apache warrior, two solitary souls who had found in each other a refuge from the storm, both outside and within. Their coming together was not an act of sudden passion, but a quiet, deliberate exploration, a mapping of scars, both seen and unseen. It was a promise whispered in the language of touch, a pact sealed not with words, but with a profound and gentle closeness in the shelter of the small cabin, with the rain-washed world sleeping outside. They chose to face the coming danger not as two individuals, but as one. When the first pale gray light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the shutters, the storm had passed. The air that seeped into the cabin was cold and clean, smelling of wet earth and pine. The fire was nothing but a pile of gray ash. They moved about the small space in a quiet, shared purpose, gathering what they would need. Eliza packed a small satchel with food and the last of her bandages. Naichi checked his weapons, his movements once again imbued with a deadly focus. But this time, it was not the focus of a lone wolf. It was the focus of a protector who fought for more than just himself. As they stood at the door, ready to step out into the uncertain morning, he turned to her. In the cool light, he looked at her not as a liability or a burden, but as his partner. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. "We go together," he said, and this time it was not an argument. It was a promise. They unbarred the door and stepped out into the dawn, a single, unified team. The journey to Cottonwood Creek was a pilgrimage into a different world. They left the ravaged, muddy streets of Dry Creek behind and entered a landscape that had drunk deeply from the storm. The air was cool and sharp, and the scent of wet sage and creosote was a clean, wild perfume. They moved on foot, Naichi setting a pace that was swift but sustainable, his moccasins making little sound on the damp earth. He taught Eliza to walk as he did, to place her feet carefully, to use the contours of the land for cover, to read the stories left by a displaced stone or a broken twig. She was a quick study, her mind, accustomed to the precise logic of a sewing pattern, now absorbing the more ancient and vital patterns of survival. They traveled for the better part of the day, speaking little, their communication a shared language of glances and gestures. The trust forged in the firelit cabin had become a quiet, steady thing between them, a foundation upon which they could build this desperate plan. By late afternoon, Naichi held up a hand, stopping her in the shadow of a tall rock spire. Below them, nestled in a curve of the land, was a slash of vibrant green, a thick grove of cottonwood trees that followed the path of a hidden waterway. Cottonwood Creek. It was an oasis of life in the stark landscape, its leaves shimmering like 1,000 silver coins in the breeze. But Naichi's eyes were not on the beauty of the place. They were narrowed, focused, reading the signs of the human poison that had seeped into the sanctuary. From their hidden vantage point on the ridge, the camp was laid out below them like a map. A half-dozen rough tents were clustered around a central campfire. A makeshift corral held about 10 horses. Men moved about with a lazy, confident air, their rifles leaning against trees, their voices carrying on the wind. Naichi counted 8 of them, not including any who might be inside the tents, and in the center of the camp. Tied to a thick cottonwood trunk that served as a cruel mockery of the life-giving grove, were several figures. Even from this distance, Eliza could see the slump of their shoulders, the utter dejection in their posture. "Taza," she whispered, her hand on Naichi's arm. He nodded, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on a small, slight figure with hair that had been brutally chopped short. "She is there, but there are others. 3 others. They look like railroad men. Witnesses." The thought struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. McKendry had not just kidnapped Taza. He had silenced the men who had seen his hired guns commit the robbery. The conspiracy was wider and more ruthless than she had dared to imagine. "They are too comfortable," Naichi said, his voice a low murmur. "They do not expect an attack. They believe their tracks were washed away by the storm. They believe no one knows this place." He looked at Eliza, his dark eyes serious. "Your plan is the only one. But if they suspect you for even a second—" "They will not," she said, her own voice sounding surprisingly calm. She had walked through a fire of fear in the last week, and what had emerged was a cool, hard resolve. "I worked in McKendry's office. I know the way these men think. They are motivated by greed and comfort. I will offer them both." They waited until the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of apricot and rose. It was the time of day when men grew tired and careless, their thoughts turning to the evening meal. Eliza took off her dusty outer skirt, revealing the clean, simple dress she wore beneath. She tucked the stray hairs back into her bun, transforming herself from a woman of the wilderness into a woman of the town. Naichi gave her final instructions, his voice low and urgent, detailing the layout of the camp, the likely positions of the guards. "Draw them to the north side, near the horse corral," he said. "Talk about whiskey. They will listen." She nodded, took a deep breath, and began to walk down the gentle slope toward the camp. She did not run or hide. She walked with a steady, purposeful stride, as if she had every right to be there. She carried nothing in her hands. She was a message, not a threat. The first guard saw her when she was 50 yards out. He straightened up from his lazy slouch, his hand going to his rifle. "Hold right there," he shouted. Eliza stopped, raising a hand to shield her eyes from the setting sun. "I am looking for a Mr. Rourke," she called out, her voice clear and steady. "I have a delivery for him, from Mr. McKendry." Her words had the desired effect. The guard's suspicion was immediately diluted by curiosity and the authority of McKendry's name. Another man emerged from a tent, his shirt unbuttoned, a tin cup in his hand. "A delivery?" he asked, his voice thick with a city accent. "That is right," Eliza said, walking closer. "A private delivery. Mr. McKendry was concerned for your comfort out here. He sent a crate, some quality whiskey, I believe, and cigars." She stopped at the edge of the camp, forcing them to come to her. "My wagon threw a wheel a mile back. I came ahead to find you." It was a perfect lie, built on the foundation of their own arrogance and their employer's habits. McKendry was known for rewarding his men. 2 more guards ambled over. Their interest piqued. They were a hard-looking lot, their faces unshaven, their eyes cold, but they were also bored. And the promise of good whiskey was a powerful lure. "Where is this crate?" one of them asked. "Just up the trail," Eliza said, pointing vaguely back the way she had come. "It is too heavy for me to carry alone." As the 4 men huddled, debating whether to go and look, Naichi moved. While their attention was fixed on Eliza, he slipped from the rocks and flowed into the shadows on the south side of the camp, a silent, deadly current of motion. He was a ghost in the twilight, his feet making no sound on the damp ground, He moved behind the tents, a predator in his own hunting grounds. He reached the large cottonwood tree. Taza saw him first. Her eyes, which had been dull with despair, suddenly widened. A spark of life returned to them. He put a finger to his lips, a silent command. She nodded. A single, almost imperceptible movement. The 3 railroad men beside her were gaunt and hollow-eyed, their wrists and ankles raw from the ropes. They were too beaten down to even register his presence. With a few deft, silent strokes of his knife, Naichi severed the ropes that bound the prisoners. He helped Taza to her feet, his touch on her arm both a greeting and a command. She was weak, but her spirit was a fire that had not been extinguished. He gestured for the other men to rise, his eyes urging them to silence. He pointed toward the thickest part of the cottonwood grove, where the creek ran deep and fast, a path of escape. At the edge of the camp, Eliza's ruse was beginning to fray. A tall, whip-thin man with a cruel, narrow face had emerged from the largest tent, Jed Rourke. His eyes were not clouded by greed or boredom. They were sharp, intelligent, and instantly suspicious. "McKendry sent you," Rourke asked, his voice a low, dangerous drawl. He ignored the story about the whiskey and focused on her. "Alone. The driver is with the wagon," Eliza said, her heart starting to beat faster. Rourke was different from the others. He was a true predator. Rourke took a step closer, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "That is a town dress," he said, "not trail clothes. And your hands are clean." He smiled, a cold, thin expression that held no humor. "McKendry did not send you." In that moment, a shout erupted from the center of the camp. One of the remaining guards had noticed the empty tree. "The prisoners. They are gone." Rourke's head snapped around. The game was over. He drew his pistol with a speed that was almost faster than the eye could see. "It is a trap," he roared. He turned his cold eyes back on Eliza, the gun leveling at her heart. But before he could fire, an arrow hissed out of the twilight and slammed into the shoulder of the guard nearest him. The man grunted. Staggering back, Naichi had fired from the shadows, a deliberate, non-lethal shot designed to create chaos. All hell broke loose. The hired guns, caught by surprise, started firing wildly into the trees. Eliza dropped to the ground, crawling for the cover of a stack of supply crates. Naichi, Taza, and the railroad men were already moving, disappearing into the deep gloom of the cottonwood grove. Rourke was the only one who kept his head. He ignored the others and ran straight for Eliza, firing as he came. A bullet splintered the wood of the crate just inches from her face. She scrambled backward, her feet sliding in the mud. Naichi saw the danger. He loosed another arrow, this one aimed at Rourke's gun hand, but the bounty hunter was moving too fast. The arrow flew wide. Naichi knew he had to draw Rourke away from Eliza. He broke cover, letting out a sharp cry, and sprinted toward the creek bank. Rourke's attention shifted instantly. He forgot about Eliza and turned, his professional hunter's instinct locking onto the more immediate threat. "He is mine!" he shouted to his men, and plunged into the trees after Naichi. The chase was a desperate, chaotic scramble along the muddy creek bank. The recent storm had turned the creek into a swift, brown torrent. Naichi used the terrain to his advantage, leaping over fallen logs and using the thick tree trunks for cover. Rourke was relentless, firing his pistol, the bullets thudding into the wet bark of the cottonwoods. Taza, despite her weakness, led Eliza and the railroad men downstream, away from the fight. Eliza looked back, her heart in her throat, as the sounds of the gunshots grew more distant. She saw Naichi, a fleeting shadow against the dark water, leading Rourke on a deadly chase. Rourke was getting closer. Naichi's wounded arm was slowing him down. As he vaulted a tangle of roots, his foot slipped in the slick mud. He fell, giving Rourke a clear shot. Rourke stopped, took careful aim, a triumphant sneer on his face. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, a shape hurtled out of the darkness and slammed into him. It was Taza. She had sent the others ahead and doubled back. She was small, but she was wiry and filled with a righteous fury. She knocked Rourke off balance, his shot going wide. The momentary distraction was all Naichi needed. He was on his feet, his knife in his hand, but Rourke was a snake. He shoved Taza away and scrambled backward, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket as he retreated. It was a telegraph flimsy. He waved it at Naichi. "It is over," Chief Rourke yelled, his voice echoing over the rushing water. "A new wire from McKendry. He wants the loose ends tied up. All of them your sister, the railroad men, and the little school teacher. You cannot protect them all." With a final, parting shot that forced Naichi to take cover, Rourke turned and vanished into the darkness. He was not beaten. He was retreating to regroup, to hunt them all down with the full authority of his employer's kill order. Naichi helped Taza up, his hand briefly gripping her shoulder. There were no words. There did not need to be. They found Eliza and the others huddled in a thicket downstream. The railroad men were terrified, but unharmed. They had escaped, but they were far from safe. One of the railroad men, an older fellow with a grizzled beard, spoke, his voice hoarse. "That ledger, the one in the tent, it has got all the payroll records. It will prove McKendry has been cooking the books, paying for a ghost army of guards that do not exist. That is what this is all about. The robbery was just a cover to get rid of us, the ones who knew." They were all loose ends, and Rourke held the telegraph ordering them cut. "We cannot go back to Dry Creek," Eliza said, stating the obvious. "No," Naichi agreed, his gaze turning to the north. "We go forward." He looked at the small, bedraggled group, a collection of fugitives bound together by a shared enemy. "We go to Cedar Junction. We find this Judge Boone." Cedar Junction was not Dry Creek, where Dry Creek was a raw, festering wound of a town. Cedar Junction had the settled feel of a place that had survived its own violent birth and was now putting on airs. It had a 2-story hotel, a real church with a painted steeple, and a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without either driver having to curse the other's lineage. They arrived on market day, a calculated risk. The town was a churning sea of humanity, a chaotic mix of ranchers, farmers, miners, and merchants, their voices a constant, rolling hubbub. The crowd provided cover, a place for a small band of fugitives to become anonymous. But it was also a tinderbox, ready to ignite with a single spark. The court, as they had been told, was a temporary affair, set up in a massive grain warehouse at the end of the market square. The cavernous space smelled of raw grain, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of molasses. Sunlight streamed through the high, dirty windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust like a heavenly host presiding over the rough-hewn proceedings. A makeshift judge's bench had been fashioned from stacked flour sacks, and a sturdy shipping crate served as the witness stand. At the center of it all sat Judge Cyrus Boone, a man whose face looked as if it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains he judged. He was old, with a fringe of white hair and eyes that seemed to have witnessed every sin man had yet devised. He listened, his hands steepled before him, a still point in the turning world. Naichi remained outside, a sentinel hidden in the bustling market, his instinct screaming that this wooden box of a courthouse was a trap. It was too exposed. Taza, her face scrubbed clean and wearing a simple dress Eliza had altered for her, sat with the 3 railroad men on a rough plank bench, a small, defiant island of witnesses. Silas McKendry was already there, not as a prisoner, but as a concerned citizen. He stood beside the town's sheriff, projecting an aura of calm authority, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the rustic setting. He had ridden here himself, a bold move to control the narrative, to paint himself as a man of the law, eager to see justice done. He nodded gravely as Judge Boone began. Eliza was the first to be called. She walked to the stand, her heart a steady, determined drumbeat. She looked directly at Judge Boone, ignoring the burning stare of Silas McKendry. In a clear, unwavering voice, she recounted the events of the robbery. She spoke of the robber's Eastern accents, of the fine stitching on the handkerchief, and of the brass shell casing. When she presented the casing, a low murmur went through the crowd of spectators who had gathered at the back of the warehouse. Next came Gus, the oldest of the railroad men. He was a stooped, weary man, but when he spoke, his voice was filled with the conviction of a man with nothing left to lose. He presented the payroll ledger they had retrieved from the camp. "This here is the book. Your Honor," he said, his calloused finger tracing a line on the page, "shows every crate of supplies shipped out to the work camps. Right here," he tapped the page, "is the entry for a crate of custom ammunition, signed for and dispatched 3 days before the robbery. And the signature authorizing the shipment is right there." Judge Boone leaned forward, his shrewd eyes examining the book. "And whose signature is that?" "Silas McKendry's," Gus said, the name dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep well. McKendry laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "This is preposterous. A forged document presented by a disgruntled employee, and the word of a known Apache sympathizer." But Judge Boone was not looking at him. He was looking at Taza as she took the stand. She was small and looked younger than her years, but her gaze was direct and unflinching. She spoke in a quiet, clear voice, telling the court of her abduction, of hearing the men plan the robbery, of their boasts that the blame would fall on her people. Judge Boone listened to it all, his face unreadable. When the testimony was finished, he sat back, the silence in the warehouse growing thick and heavy. Finally, he looked at Silas McKendry, and his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "Mr. McKendry," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the vast room, "there is enough here to warrant a full investigation. I am ordering you to be taken into custody by the federal marshal to be questioned in Prescott." The words were a lightning strike. The crowd gasped. McKendry's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A flash of pure animal fury passed through his eyes before he masked it with a look of theatrical outrage. On what grounds, he thundered? The word of a savage and a hysterical woman. "On the grounds of evidence that suggests your direct involvement in armed robbery, kidnapping, and murder," Boone replied, his voice unyielding. McKendry knew the legal battle was lost, so he abandoned the courtroom and turned his appeal to the only jury he could control. He turned to the crowd. "Friends, neighbors, you see what is happening here. Our justice system, twisted by outside interests, is being used to persecute the very men who are trying to build a future for this territory. They take the word of an Apache over a man who has invested his own fortune in your prosperity." He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather bag. With a grand gesture, he upended it, and a cascade of gold and silver coins clattered onto the dusty floor. "This is what they want," he shouted, kicking a $20 gold piece toward the spectators. "The wealth that we create while you all live in fear of raids, of your homes being burned, of your families being slaughtered. This court seeks to punish me and give comfort to our enemies." The mood in the warehouse shifted. The quiet curiosity of the spectators began to curdle into something ugly. Men at the back started to shout. The deep-seated prejudice, the ever-present fear of the frontier, was a far more powerful force than any ledger book. And at that precise moment, the great doors of the warehouse swung open. Jed Rourke strode in. Flanked by 2 of his men, he moved with a predator's swagger, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Judge Boone. "I hear you are looking for a murderer." "Judge," Rourke said, his voice carrying an insolent drawl. He pointed a long, grimy finger, not at McKendry, but toward the open doors where Nietzsche stood watching, a silent shadow against the bright chaos of the market. "There he is, Nietzsche. I saw him myself. He is the one who shot down Jebediah Stone, one of McKendry's guards, in cold blood during that robbery." It was a lie, clean and simple, delivered with the absolute confidence of a man who had never suffered the consequences of his own evil. Nietzsche did not move, but Eliza saw his hand drop to the knife at his hip. Rourke then turned his gaze on Taza, and a slow, Venomous smile spread across his face. He mouthed a single word to her, a silent threat that made the color drain from her face. Judge Boone slammed his hand down on the flour sacks. "This is a court of law, Mr. Rourke, not a saloon brawl if you have testimony. You will give it under oath." But it was too late. McKendry had his spark. Rourke had provided the fuel. The crowd at the back of the warehouse began to surge forward, their face a mask of rage. "Hang him," someone yelled. "Hang the Apache murderer." Suddenly, a gunshot cracked from outside, then another. Panic erupted. The crowd, which had been a menacing mob, instantly became a terrified herd. People screamed and scrambled for cover, overturning benches, desperate to escape the unseen threat. Through the open doors, Eliza saw them. A dozen of McKendry's men, dismounted and armed with rifles, were advancing on the warehouse, firing into the air. It was not a riot. It was a rescue, a coordinated assault to free their master. "Marshal, hold that door," Boone bellowed, his authority absolute even in the chaos. He pointed a trembling but determined finger at McKendry. "Silas McKendry, I am issuing a federal warrant for your arrest. You are now a fugitive from justice." McKendry simply smiled. His men were already at the doors, pushing their way through the terrified crowd. Rourke and his men drew their pistols, providing cover. The makeshift courtroom had become a battlefield. Eliza Taza. Now Naichi's voice cut through the din. He had materialized at their side, pulling them toward a small loading door at the side of the warehouse that the crowd had overlooked in their panic. Gus and the other railroad men followed close behind. They scrambled out into a narrow alleyway, the sounds of shouting and gunfire echoing behind them. Naichi led them through a maze of backways and service alleys, moving with a swift, certain purpose. He paused at a corner, looking back. Through a gap in the buildings, they could see McKendry, flanked by Rourke and his men, mounting their horses and galloping out of town, disappearing into the dust and chaos they had created. They had won the legal argument, but they had lost the war. Justice, in its temporary home in the grain warehouse, had been proven to be a fragile thing, easily shattered by money and violence. They were fugitives now, all of them, holding a judge's warrant that was worth less than the paper it was written on. They had the evidence, the witnesses, and the moral authority of the law, but McKendry had the guns, and in the Arizona territory. That was the only law that truly mattered. The chaos of Cedar Junction was behind them, a whirlwind of dust and gunfire, but the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the heavy, charged silence of a hunt, and they were the prey. They took shelter in a hidden arroyo as night fell. The five of them, Naichi, Eliza, Taza, and the two remaining railroad men. Gus and a young man named Finn. Gus, his face a roadmap of worry in the flickering firelight, was the one who finally gave voice to the fear that coiled in all their stomachs. "He will not run," Gus said, staring into the flames as if reading a terrible prophecy. "McKendry. He is not the running type. He is the cornered animal type, the kind that chews off its own leg to get out of the trap, and then comes back to kill the trapper." "He has the warrant on him now," Eliza said, though her words lacked conviction. "He is a fugitive." Gus shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "A piece of paper. He will burn it. No, he needs something bigger now. Something to wipe the slate clean. Something to make everyone forget about a small-town robbery and a rigged court hearing." He looked up, his eyes finding Naichi's in the darkness. "He needs a tragedy." It was then that Gus's railroad knowledge, a lifetime of schedules and tonnage and stress loads, coalesced into a horrifying certainty. "The bridge," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The new trestle bridge at Eagle Canyon. They are due to run the first heavy freight train across it tomorrow. A public demonstration." Silas was so proud of it. His great bridge, connecting the territory, bringing civilization. He would not destroy his own bridge. Finn, the younger man, argued. "He would," Gus said, his voice dropping, "if it served him, Think of it, a terrible disaster. A passenger train, not a freight train, loaded with families, plunges into the canyon. A deliberate act of sabotage. And who would be blamed? The savage Apache murderer. Naichi, already accused of killing his guards, now leading a war party to stop the march of progress. McKendry would not be a fugitive anymore. He would be a victim, a hero, even. And the governor would give him a blank check to form a militia and wipe every last Apache off the land he wants. The pieces fell into place with a sickening click. The land seizure was the final prize. The robbery, the kidnapping, Taza's suffering, it was all a prelude to this one grand, monstrous act. They had to stop him, not just to clear their names, but to prevent a massacre. The race to Eagle Canyon was a desperate, lung-burning ordeal. They traveled through the night, guided by Naichi's unerring sense of the land and Gus's knowledge of the railroad's path. They arrived as the sun was setting, a spectacular, bloody smear of orange and crimson across the western sky. The canyon was a breathtaking, terrifying gash in the earth, 1,000 feet deep, and spanning it was the bridge, a delicate latticework of iron and steel, a testament to man's ambition and fragility. It hummed in the cold wind that funneled through the canyon, a low, mournful note. McKendry was there, on the far side, a commanding figure surrounded by a dozen of his men. They were not hiding. They were waiting. On the near side, the tracks stretched back into the twilight, empty, but they could all feel it, a faint vibration in the rails, a promise of the immense weight and power that was coming their way. "He has men on the support pillars," Naichi observed, his eyes scanning the structure below. "They will have set the charges on the main trusses. They will let the engine get halfway across before they blow it." "The passengers," Eliza said, her voice tight with horror. "They will not even know." There was no time for a complex plan. There was only time for action. "Taza," Naiche said, his voice calm and clear, "you are the best shot. Get to that high outcrop. Stop anyone who tries to get to the detonator box." He handed her his rifle. She took it, her face grim and determined, and melted into the rocks. "Gus, Finn, you know the train," he continued. "If we can get you on board, can you stop it?" "If we can get to the engine," Gus said, his eyes on the approaching plume of smoke in the distance. "The main brake is there, but they will have a man on the engineer." "Eliza," Naichi said, turning to her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she met his gaze without flinching. "You stay with Gus and Finn. Help them get to the engine." He looked at her, a world of unspoken words passing between them. Then he turned his attention to the bridge, and to the figures moving on the catwalks. Jed Rourke was among them, his lean form unmistakable. "Rourke is mine." The train appeared, a black monster breathing smoke and steam, its single headlight cutting a pale circle in the deepening gloom. It was moving fast, too fast for a test run. Naichi, Eliza, and the two railroad men scrambled down the steep embankment to the base of the bridge's massive stone abutment. The ground shook as the engine thundered closer. Now Naichi yelled over the roar. He gave Gus a boost up onto a steel ladder. The plan was desperate: climb the abutment and jump onto the slow-moving maintenance ladder of the coal car as it passed. Gus went first, then Finn. Eliza was last. She looked down and saw Naichi, a reassuring presence in the chaos. He nodded to her, a silent encouragement, before he vaulted onto the lower catwalk of the bridge and sprinted into the twilight, a phantom of vengeance. Eliza pulled herself onto the coal car, her hands raw, her dress tearing on the rough metal. The noise was deafening, the vibration rattling her teeth. Gus was already moving, clambering over the mountain of coal toward the engine cab. A gunshot rang out. One of McKendry's men was in the cab, his pistol aimed at the engineer's head. On the bridge, the battle had begun. Naichi moved with a blinding, fluid grace, his knife against their guns. He used the bridge itself as a weapon, the narrow walkways, the dizzying height. But his true target was Rourke, who waited for him in the center of the span. a wolfish grin on his face. The train was upon them now, its immense weight making the entire structure shudder and sway. "Just you and me," Chief Rourke roared over the train, drawing his pistol. They met in a clash of steel and fury on a narrow steel beam no wider than a man's foot. Below them, the canyon yawned, a pit of blackness. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them from their perch. Rourke was a brute, all savage strength and wild swings. Naichi was a dancer, his movements economical, his knife a flickering extension of his hand. In the engine cab, Eliza and Gus burst in. The gunman swung toward them, firing. Finn cried out, clutching his arm. Gus, with a roar of pure rage, tackled the man, and they went down, struggling for the gun. The engineer, a terrified man with sweat pouring down his face, kept his hands on the controls. The brake, Eliza screamed, pointing at a large iron lever. "I cannot," the engineer cried. "He will shoot us all." Eliza looked past them, through the front window of the cab. She could see the center of the bridge rushing toward them. She saw the small, canvas-wrapped packages tied to the main support beam. She saw the wires leading away. And she saw Naichi and Rourke, two figures locked in a deadly struggle, silhouetted against the firebox glow. She did not hesitate. She lunged for the brake lever, throwing her entire body weight against it. The gunman, momentarily distracted by Gus, could not stop her. With a deafening screech of tortured metal, the train's wheels locked. The massive machine began to slow, its momentum a terrible, irresistible force. But it was slowing. The sudden, violent jolt threw Naichi and Rourke off balance. Rourke stumbled, his arms flailing. Naichi seized the opening. He drove his shoulder into Rourke's chest. Not a killing blow, but a powerful, disarming one. Rourke cried out, his pistol flying from his grasp, arcing through the air before disappearing into the canyon below. Naichi twisted, hooking his leg around Rourke's, and threw him to the metal decking of the bridge. He landed with a bone-jarring thud. The fight knocked out of him. On the far side of the canyon, Silas McKendry watched, his face a mask of disbelief as his perfect plan literally ground to a halt. His men, seeing Rourke fall, lost their nerve. McKendry turned to the man at the detonator box. "Do it now," he screamed. Before the man could obey, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the high rocks. A puff of dust erupted from the dirt a foot in front of the detonator box. Taza's warning shot. The man at the box froze, looking up at the unseen sniper, then back at his furious employer. He held up his hands and backed away. The train had stopped, its engine sitting just feet from the explosives. The passenger cars, full of shocked and bewildered people, were now a silent audience to the drama. Doors opened, and faces appeared at the windows. They saw it all. They saw the wounded railroad man, the heroic engineer, and the soot-covered woman in the engine cab. They saw the defeated bounty hunter on the bridge, his hands raised in surrender as Naichi stood over him. And they saw Silas McKendry, the great railroad baron, standing beside an infernal machine, his murderous plot laid bare for all the world to see. Taza fired one more shot, this one kicking up the dust at McKendry's feet. The message was clear. There was no escape. Trapped between the train full of witnesses and the rifle of a girl he had wronged, Silas McKendry slowly, stiffly, raised his hands in the air. The wind still howled through Eagle Canyon, but its song had changed. It was no longer a mournful dirge. The bridge, the symbol of connection, had held. It had been tested by greed and fire, and it had survived. In the quiet aftermath, as the setting sun finally disappeared, leaving the world in a wash of purple and indigo, a fragile, hard-won peace settled over the iron bridge. The aftermath of the confrontation at Eagle Canyon was not a thunderclap of retribution, but a slow, quiet dawn of truth. The passengers on the train, having witnessed the raw, undeniable facts of Silas McKendry's villainy, became a chorus of voices that could not be silenced. When the federal marshals, summoned by a telegraph from Judge Boone, finally arrived. They did not find a chaotic scene of an Apache raid, but a grim tableau of a crime exposed. They took McKendry and a sullen Jed Rourke away in chains, their departure unlamented, the power they had wielded now nothing more than a bad memory. The trial in Prescott was a formality. Faced with a life of hard labor, Jed Rourke, a man loyal only to his own skin, sang like a canary. He laid out the entire conspiracy in painstaking detail. From the staged robbery and the murder of the guards to the kidnapping of Taza and the grand final plan to destroy the bridge. He confessed to everything, his words a venomous tide that washed away every last stone of the fortress of lies McKendry had built. Silas McKendry was sentenced to the federal prison at Yuma, a place from which few men ever returned. His empire of greed and fear crumbled into the red dust from which it had been built. Back in Dry Creek, the news arrived not with a shout of triumph, but with a collective, weary sigh of relief. The poison had been drawn from the wound. Deputy Bale was stripped of his badge and left town in the dead of night, a disgraced coward. The town, left without its puppet master, was forced to look at itself, at the ugliness that had been stoked in its heart, and to choose a new path. The following autumn, a year after the first gunshot had shattered the desert peace, Dry Creek was a different place. The heat was still sharp, but the oppressive fever of suspicion was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile coolness of hope. The change was most visible at the town's well. The water level was still dangerously low, a constant reminder of the thirst that had driven so much of the conflict. But now, it was a shared problem. Not a weapon. Naichi, working with Gus and the other railroad men who had chosen to stay, devised a plan. They would dig a new, deeper well, not in the center of town, but on neutral ground between the settlement and the Apache village. The railroad, under new, more scrupulous management, contributed funds as a form of restitution. The people of the town, shamed into a new kind of honesty, donated what they could. It was a community, well, a place where justice was not just a word, but a thing you could draw up in a bucket and drink. The small schoolhouse, once a place of whispered secrets for Eliza, was reopened. The town council, in a unanimous vote, offered her the position of official teacher, but she had a condition. The school would be open to all children, settler and Apache alike. There were grumbles, old prejudices dying hard. But the tide had turned. On the first day of the new term, Quito and Beisha walked in not through the back, but through the front door, and sat beside the children of the blacksmith and the merchant. Taza was there too, not as a student, but as an assistant. Her quiet strength and gentle voice a bridge between the two languages, the two worlds. She had found her voice not in victimhood, but in the quiet, powerful act of building a future. Naiche had changed as well. The solitary warrior who had moved like a ghost through the wilderness now walked the single street of Dry Creek in the full light of day. He was no longer a man living on the defensive, his trust a shattered thing. He had seen that a bridge, whether made of steel or of the human heart, could hold. He spent his days working on the new well, his powerful shoulders side by side with the men who had once wanted to see him hang. He was teaching them the ways of the land, how to find water, how to respect the delicate balance of the desert, and in return, they were teaching him the clumsy, halting language of community. He was building a life, not just for himself, but for his people, a life based on the radical notion that they could not only coexist, but thrive together. Eliza watched all of this, her heart full of a quiet, profound joy. The woman who had arrived in the territory as a refugee from a broken heart, who had been scorned as an outsider, was now the vital center of the town's healing. She had woven the disparate threads of the community together with the same care and precision she used on her finest stitches. She had created not just a school, but a sanctuary. One afternoon, as the autumn sun cast long, golden shadows across the desert floor, Naichi came to her at the schoolhouse. The last of the children had gone home, and the room was filled with a peaceful, dusty silence. He did not speak for a long moment. simply stood in the doorway, watching her. He was no longer the wounded, desperate man who had fallen into her cabin during the storm. He was whole. He was home. They were married on a clear, cool morning at the place where the desert met the newly tamed land. There was no church, no preacher in a black coat. Their church was the vast blue sky, and their vows were witnessed by the silent, ancient saguaros. Gus stood as a witness for Eliza, and Taza stood for her brother. The attendees were a strange and wonderful collection: the blacksmith, the merchant's family, the grizzled railroad men, and a quiet, dignified delegation from Naichi's village. They stood together, two separate peoples, sharing the same patch of earth, watching as a new kind of family was forged in the morning light. The ceremony was simple, a few words spoken from the heart. Eliza wore a plain cotton dress, and Naichi wore the simple buckskin of his people. They held hands, their fingers intertwined, a silent testament to the journey that had brought them to this place. As a soft breeze whispered through the brittle bush and across the ocotillo, Naichi squeezed her hand. He leaned in close, his voice a low murmur meant only for her, a final, gentle echo of the words that had changed everything. "You did not leave that night," he said, his eyes full of a love that was as vast and as deep as the desert sky. And in his words, Eliza heard the promise of 1,000 dawns to come, a shared future built not on the shifting sands of fear, but on the solid rock of a courageous and abiding love. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the heart of the Old West. Please comment with where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.